Okay, thank you all so much for having me here, and thank you for the introduction. I kind of always have to caveat I was the first female deputy president because I was doing women's studies at the time and nearly ended up failing out because I was so confident and so focused on getting elected. So I was like, I'm just putting the theory into action, and then I got elected, and it kind of excused my deplorable studies for the year. So thank you so much for having me here today to talk about student success. And I'm looking at the gorgeous drawing at the back and all the different themes that are coming through, and I hope that this presentation somewhat ties some of that together and kind of gives us a framework to think about what is student success, how do we embody it in the work that we're doing, and exactly, I think it's an idea that sometimes is a little bit kind of hard to comprehend, and if people are hoping that there's going to be like a bullet point on exactly what student success is, you aren't going to like the slide that says there is no one way to define student success. So I have to apologise in advance for that, but we're going to give it my best shot. So it's always useful when you show up on the slide and it's your own face and not someone else's. As I said, I'm the former president of the Union of Students in Ireland. I was on the board of AHEAD, I was on the board of ICOS, and I used to work with the Northside Community Partnership as their education advisor. So I've been muddling around this for a while. And I was the chair of the scoping group for the Student Success Project last year, which was led by the National Forum for Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, and it was between the HEA, and there are some people who are in the room here who potentially were part of that scoping group, and some of the discussions we had on what exactly is student success and how do we as higher education practitioners embody that into the work that we do. So today I'm going to cover exactly what it says on the tin, student success. What is student success, and are we actually setting our students up for it? I think the idea also just about student success, we talked for a couple of years about retention and retention projects and how do we keep students in. And I think student success is an evolvement of that. It's not only how do we keep students in and make sure that they don't leave at different points throughout their higher education career, but how do we ensure that they are successful and supported during their time in higher education. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we face. One of the big ones, it starts with an F and ends in unding, usually funding. But there are some other barriers as well, some institutional driven, some socially driven, some economically driven, and we might talk through some of those. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how our higher education institutions uphold their share of the social contract and help more students succeed. And as many of us will possibly know, sometimes when we try and introduce new ideas or new concepts into our higher education institutions, they can sometimes be met with some resistance. Sometimes it can be hard to see change happen. You see glaciers kind of taking over to your left and they're speeding on ahead of you. So sometimes it can be difficult to ensure that we get these new ideas and these new concepts really ingrained into our higher education institutions. And then how do we drive change as higher education practitioners? What is it that we can do in our work, or what structures can we talk about needing to be brought into our higher education institutions? So, who is student success for? I mean, it's in the title, it's for students. Sometimes when we talk about student success, we can get a little bit lost in the philosophical ideas of what does this mean? Who are we talking about? What is success? How do we do it? And we can move, I think, a little bit away from actually who it is that we're talking about. And always whenever I was talking about this or chairing a group on this, it was we need to keep bringing it back to the person that this is supposed to be for, and that is that there is a student at the centre of this. Sometimes there are thousands of students at the centre of this, but that is what we are working towards. We're working towards ensuring those students, those target students outlined in the National Access Plan, that those students are supported during their time in higher education. The next slide is a quick video that we made a few years ago, before I had even really talked about student success. I hadn't really had that phrase used. I made it during my time in the Union of Students in Ireland, and it was a video that we made with students about no labels, no limits. So it was just students talking about the opportunities that they were afforded in higher education, and the supports that they got that helped them succeed. And I just, when I was preparing for this, remembered this video because one of the students actually used the phrase student success. They talked about how the supports they got supported them in succeeding and being successful in higher education. So I just thought it would be something interesting just to give a kind of framework from a student perspective of what success means and what those supports mean to those students.
When I was in primary school, I received a lot of support from my principal in the form of extra resource hours. This allowed me to keep up with my schoolwork. Along with the support of my principal and family, this has helped me to get where I am today.
So when I got my offer from the CEO, my worries actually started crumbling down because I was worried as to how I'd get through university. I didn't know anything about the supports available or anything like that. So what I did was I just basically went into Access Office or Map Lodge in here in Maynooth, and they put me in touch with a disability advisor. The key to success with a disability or different ability in university is to reach out and advocate for yourself.
During my time in college, I've got a lot of support from the Access Office, such as note taker, the use of a laptop, and one-to-one tuition, which helps me with projects. These supports allow me to fully take part in college life.
When you have a disability, like a spinal cord injury, it can be very difficult to navigate in college. But when you join a club or society, such as the archery club, you find people who have similar interests to you and your sport. And then after that, your disability fades into the background, so you no longer have a physical disability, you're just an archer.
No Labels, No Limits is a national campaign which is about promoting student disability awareness across colleges in Ireland. It's about talking about the fact that so many of us face loads of challenges while we're in college, but that there are supports available. One of the first places to go is to check out the Access Office, where you can make an appointment with your Disability Office Advisor. He'll talk to you about some of the things that you can do, like getting a personal assistant, or getting a scribe for class, or maybe some extra exam supports to give you extra time during the exam time.
No labels, no limits.
I was wondering, would it just stop or fade off into the background? So I hope I didn't realise how fast they were speaking until I was listening to it there. I was like, wow, she just speaks really fast. So I hope that just gave just a little bit of a framework in terms of student success and what really helped those students succeed. So Mark talked about the primary school support that he got, early intervention, that there was a principal who recognised that he needed extra hours and extra supports, and the fact that that happened at an early stage supported him through that second level and on into third level. And he went on to become the president of GMIT Students' Union, and he often talked about how, had that early intervention not happened, he simply wouldn't have made it to where he was today. James Cawley talked about the support that he needed and how he took it upon himself to find those supports. He went through the Access Office, and he referenced his own key to success was reaching out and advocating for himself. I think that we kind of have to take that with somewhat of an acknowledgement that not all students are in a position to do that, and not all of our higher education institutions have the online resources up to the standard where a student can find the supports that are available to them, the signposting, the communication, how do you get supports if you need them? And that's a big thing, I think, when we talk about student success, is actually where do students, if they decide to go and look for support, where do they find it? And is it easily accessible? And in James's case, it was accessible. He was able to find it and he was able to get the support that he needs. And he's now a teacher. Mikey talked about the kind of more physical supports that he got. So he had someone who was a note taker with him, which helped him keep up with class, and the laptop. And he said that those two things helped him to fully participate in student life. So the fact of having those extra pieces of support helped him fully integrate into the higher education over in GMIT. Kerry talked about her sense of belonging. Now, when she was involved in the archery club and the photography society, that gave her a sense of belonging within the higher education community, that she didn't feel ostracised or pushed aside, and that she had a community within which, and she referenced how she felt her own disability faded into the background because she had a community that she could be a part of. And that's a really strong theme when we're talking about student success, is that engagement, where students feel that there's a home for them, that they're a part of a community, and that they're included in something and that they can fully participate. And Sheena talked about the supports available and how you can find them. So even though the video isn't about student success per se, I think the participants all talked about the elements that allowed them and supported them in achieving success during their time in higher education. So as Mark said, it was the early intervention and the extra hours. James, it was being able to find the supports that were available to him. Mikey with the practical supports, the note taker and the laptop, and Kerry, her sense of integration, engagement and belonging. And I think a lot of us would agree that those are some of the key elements of student success, and they're right from the horse's mouth as well, so it's on camera. They're the students who are talking about exactly what supports they needed during their time in higher education. So I suppose the next part is, what exactly is student success? It's a good question, and I wish I could give you a really concise answer. I think there's someone down in UL doing a PhD on this, so hopefully the PhD might have a short summary at the start, which will give a really concise answer to it. But there is no one simple answer to what student success is. Fortunately, though, it's not rocket science. I think we can spend a lot of time really trying to dig very deep as to what student success means. And I honestly think that sometimes it is just looking at the very practical supports that students need during their time in higher education that will help them get through. Some of that is academic support, some of that is more physical, accessible support, UDL being kind of a part of the college institution, and it's not something that's tacked on at the end. Some of it is just giving a student a place or a sense of belonging. So as Mark said, the early intervention and support. So when we're talking about student success in higher education, I wish we could just talk about it as just being in higher education, but I think all of us know that this happens a lot earlier. That really, in order to be able to, the ideal world within which we would support students would start at a much younger age. We'd be supporting students from preschool, students from different areas, that they would have all the supports that they need. There's a lot of studies that are showing those very early interventions are really one of the drivers of success about whether a student will make it through to Leaving Cert and whether a student will make it into and succeed and through their time in higher education. And that early intervention is really, really important. Integration. So a student feeling that there is a place for them within the higher education institution. A student feeling that they are supported and that they're not somehow excluded because of their background, their socioeconomic background, their disability, where they're from, that they are still a part of that higher education community. And I understand that when we're talking about thousands and thousands of students, that can sometimes be really hard to do. But whenever we talked about student success, and that was one of the big things in the student success scoping project, was that integration piece, where students felt that they had a place and that they knew where they had to go in order to be able to find the supports they needed in order to be able to integrate into higher education. Extra time. I'm not sure where they're going to come from on the screen. That acknowledgement that not every student is going to work at this same standard pace is really, really important. And whenever I talk to students, one of the big things is that pressure. They can't meet this kind of rigid time frame that is sometimes put on our students. And we understand that we need to have deadlines there. Well, I'm not saying we throw deadlines out the window, although the amount of times they whiz by me, I don't think I'd mind. But that understanding that students sometimes need different time frames, whether that's in an exam, whether that's to complete an assignment, whether that's in class, extra time to ask questions or to engage, is something that's really important. And also the idea of extra time in terms of the length it takes to complete their higher education course. Not every student is going to or is able to complete their course of study within this time frame that we have set out as being the ideal. And I think, given we have to take funding into account, but I think that's something that's really important that higher education institutions understand, that time that some students need is just not going to match up to the time frame that we set. And because those students can't meet that time frame, that does not mean that they are no longer a success. And I think that's a really big thing that we have to be able to drive home to students, is just because you are not within that time frame, you are not a failure. And very often, when I would have met with students who were on the edge of maybe dropping out or saying that they couldn't go on, it was very often they couldn't feel that they could complete within a time frame that they'd been given. They'd maybe missed an assignment, they couldn't keep up with class, and things had spiraled out of control, and they never felt that they could catch back up again. And those very rigid systems within our higher education institutions can be a real barrier to students being able to succeed. And that idea of a student seeing themselves as a failure, I think is the worst thing that can happen, because that's something that can stay with that student right through their time in higher education if they stay, and worse still if they leave, and that stays with them. And so it's really important that time acknowledgement, that not everyone can work within the time frame that we have set out. So to reach out and advocate, and as I said, this comes with a bit of a caveat that we need to make sure that all of the information a student needs is accessible. A student, sometimes I look at some of the websites that we have and they feel like they've been made on Windows 95 and haven't been updated since. Students need to be able to access the information they need in order to be able to maybe take that first step. So that integration and accessibility of information about the supports that are available, the requirement of a student. I find it sometimes astonishing that students, when they go into higher education, at no point have it explained to them the requirements of what they need to do beyond showing up, doing exams and getting back out again. So this information hub about where students can access this information is really, really important. And as James in the video talked about, if he hadn't been able to find that information, to be able to advocate for himself, he wouldn't have been able to work his way through the system. So when we're thinking about how do we make ourselves accessible to students and support student success, that central hub or point of where that information is stored is so, so crucial. The vast majority of students will find out the information they need by going online. So we need to make sure that information is findable, accessible, understandable, and signpost students to exactly where they need to go next if they have any queries. Does that make sense? And that was something that really came up again in the Student Success Project, is how do we centralise that information? And there's so much information we want students to be able to take in. I remember my first day in UCC nearly almost passing out in the bull because there was just so much information coming at me. It was mind-boggling. So how do we make sure that information is accessible and isn't overwhelming? So that centralised, that digital hub of where students can find those supports is really, really important. The sense of belonging. We all know, have heard, or have met that student who just didn't feel that they belonged in higher education. And I think that is one of the stories that I find the hardest, is someone who even could have been at the same institution I was in and just felt completely alone, completely at sea, as if they shouldn't be there. And that really, I find that, and I'm sure many people here find that really hard to hear that they couldn't find their place in the higher education institution. And that sense of belonging is so, so important to any student that I've ever spoken to, feeling that they had a home, whether it's that they had a lecturer that they could reach out to, that there was a club or a society that supported them, that there was a support staff that they knew they could go to and wouldn't push them away or tell them that there was no time. That sense that there was somewhere for them to belong within that higher education institution, I think is one of the biggest drivers for student success, and whether a student succeeds or not, is that sense of belonging. Information, I feel like I may have said that already, but information and where students can access them. And then the supports available. So, I suppose information and supports are two sides of the one coin, but knowing where those supports are, knowing where the building is, who it is that they can talk to, who it is in their faculty that they can talk to if they have an issue, whether it's academic or otherwise. A student knowing where to go is just so, so crucial, because we can, in this room, we can put all these amazing supports together. We can have a really clear idea of what student success is, but if a student doesn't know how to be able to access those supports, or doesn't know how to reach one of us in order to be able to fulfill their potential, it kind of becomes a bit of a moot point. So actually, where are those supports? Those supports being funded, that funding word again, which is sometimes sends shivers down my spine, but that's really, really crucially important to student success. And those are, not that I came up with these words off the top of my head, these are all words that came up during our student success scoping project. These are words that students themselves in the video use that help them in order to achieve their potential. So the next slide is, I could describe it. How do I? There we go. This is a more fancy pants diagram of student success. It's not as just down to basic words, and it's plucked off the Higher Education Academy over in the UK, and there's lots of buzzwords on it, collaboration, flexibility, interconnectivity. But these are all important words and concepts as well in terms of what we understand student success being. And really, I put this kind of fancy pants diagram in to try and just drive home that student success isn't just the responsibility of those of us in the room. Student success is not just the responsibility of the student themselves. Student success has to be written into the culture and the very fabric of our higher education institutions. It has to be in the back of everyone's mind. It has to be all the way up to your upper level management, your finance department, your support services, your student societies. This needs to be woven into the fabric of our higher education institutions. Otherwise, students will fall through the cracks. We will not be able to support students the way we need to, the way that we want to, and the way I think our higher education institutions should endeavour to. So really that's what the fancy pants thing is about. And also, I think the idea of student success wasn't necessarily on the top of everyone's mind back in the day when we talked about this. When we talked about student success, I think very often it was a successful student. And if you give me a moment to differentiate, a successful student in what we would have called traditional terms is someone who got a good grade, finished within the allocated time frame, really just kind of zipped their way through, went to the library fairly regularly, got a decent job within a certain amount of time, and Tob's your uncle, off they went. And that is, I think, what our higher education institutions, sometimes some of our ideas of what student success is, we are still envisioning that as being student success. And really, I think it's important that we kind of flip this concept on its head. And this takes lots of different things into account. Student success is not just academic ability. Of course, academic ability and academic achievement is very, very important, lest there's any academics in the room. It's very important, very, very important. But it is not the only thing that we should be focusing on as higher education institutions. And I think if we can build the idea of student success into the fabric of our higher education institutions, not only will we be able to support students coming through higher education, the students who graduate from our systems will be of a different kind of student, but also as bringing students into. We're all kind of in the rat race trying to get students into our institutions. And I think an institution that champions student success as an idea of a well-rounded individual who is supported academically and socially through their own personal development, that's an institution that I think is something that is much more attractive than something that just goes, we're just going to get you through, top grade, out you go, we'll call you for some alumni money at a later point. Joe, I think the student success, we can sell it to all our different departments in our higher education institutions, people who are thinking about it financially, but also people who are thinking about who do we bring in and how do we attract students. And I think something else that sometimes comes up is, can a student be successful without meeting one of the standard metrics? So the high grade or the graduating within this set time frame. And I think we know the answer to this. And of course, a student can be successful without meeting these traditional signifiers of a successful student. And we need to think about how we ingrain that into our higher education institutions. So this is the best I could come up with. The truest definition of student success is determined by the goals and personal situation of each individual student. So if you could just write that into your, college, just write that into your, setup, that'd be super. And I understand that it's not that simple. We can't just write this as a policy into our higher education institutions. But I think it's still important to acknowledge that this is part of it. We can come up with lots of different metrics to measure student success. We can come up with our academic and finishing within a time frame, and they know where to go to get their supports. We can put all of these things together, and I think if we put them together, we'd have a fairly good measure of what student success is. But ultimately, it's still how do we support those individual students in succeeding in a way that is important to them. And I suppose I just think of this sometimes when we have students who go into, there's a big drive at the moment for students in further education or PLC courses to try and drive them through into higher education. And I think we need to make sure that that is what those students want. If students want to use that as a springboard to go on, that's really important that we facilitate and support that. But it's also okay for that student to say, actually, no, this is my measure of success. I've achieved this. This is what I wanted. And for us to facilitate and support that as well. So how we envision driving a student forward also needs to take into account what they want to see themselves going forward as well. Low power mode. So I think most people in the room would, maybe I'll get a nod if there's a nod of heads, that we'd maybe be in agreement that we need to kind of have a redefined idea of student success as being beyond the acquisition of kind of skills and knowledge. Is there a broad consensus that student success is more than simply just having knowledge and a skill set that we can fire them off into the employment market? At least I've been talking for 16 slides relatively correctly. So just a quick what we like to think the student experience looks like. So it's this kind of through a pipe. There's a little a valve there to alleviate the pressure during exam time, but it's a general moving forward through a pipe, no major problems with it. But what I think we can find the student success or student experience really looks like is perhaps a little bit more like this. And I think this is particularly reflective of my student experience where pipes were breaking and things weren't working, and it just didn't necessarily go the way that I wanted it to go. And I think that's okay. And I think if we can acknowledge, and I think most people in the room from the work that we do, we recognise that the student experience is not just linear. Students don't just simply go through on a conveyor belt and pop out the other side with maybe only one or two minor hiccups. We recognise that the student is an individual, that there are personal circumstances, that life sometimes interferes, sometimes it's the wrong subject choice, sometimes the student just didn't know where to find those supports and they ended up slipping down through the cracks for a while. And we recognise that higher education can sometimes be a little bit more bitty than the ideal that we've been told it has to be. So as much as we like the student experience to be completely linear and without complexities, we know that it's simply not true. So how do we kind of integrate that into our thinking? How do we integrate that into how we engage with students? And how do we integrate that into our kind of higher education institutions as a whole? So I suppose one of the big things, and that is one of the big barriers, is actually how do we take a fairly rigid system? I think higher education is quite rigid. There's sometimes not a lot of wiggle room in it. And we've got all sorts of like political pressures and stuff kind of upon us, telling us things have to happen a certain way. And that, I think, is one of the biggest barriers that we face as higher education practitioners, is actually how do we support students through this system, which is quite inflexible, while recognising that not everyone is going to go through it the way that we've been told they have to. So I suppose one of the big barriers that we face is that traditional measure of success, which I talked about, the finishing off in a tight time frame and no major problems and straight they go into employment. Information. Where are students getting this information? There's some people in the room who I know I've been on their higher education institution websites, and they've got these amazing hubs and supports available to them. But that information is not getting to every student the way that we want it to. Course completion. Not every student is going to complete courses in the time frame that we want, or indeed complete the course. And I think that recognition of either prior learning or the recognition of the learning that those students have undertaken in their time in higher education is something that really does need to be looked at very seriously. I know too many students who would have dropped out in the third year of a 4-year course, and those 3 years ended up fading into the distance. Or people who are coming into higher education who have a lifetime of knowledge, experience, and that just doesn't filter or feature in their learning process. So how do we recognise the learning that people have already? And if course completion is something that's not possible for a student, how do we support them in that? And is there a way that we can recognise the learning that they've done? Disinterested senior management. It was the most delicate way I could put this. I was like, how to phrase it. But that is a huge barrier. Some senior management who are under huge pressure, by the way, from funding and from different outside interest groups to produce the students that whoever needs, the employment sector, the economy, whoever it is. And it can be really hard to try and push these messages or these ideas of change into senior management. And I really think if you don't have your senior management support on this, and an awful lot of us in the room know this, we can just be kind of scrambling, doing our very best to help students. But without that real upper level belief in change and supporting students and this idea of student success, it can be really hard to achieve what it is that we want to achieve for our students. Managing expectations. So we can set ourselves up to be like, we're going to have student success at the very centre of what we do. This is going to be a student success focused institution, and every student's going to get through to the other side exactly whatever way they want, whatever way they need. And we also have to be really realistic that we can set ourselves up And I know this, and I would have worked with some students and wasn't able to support them in the way that they needed. And sometimes they're like, actually, I'm just going to politely bow out, and that was fine. But I had to then try and understand that I needed to manage not only my expectations, but the expectations for the student. And that's a really big barrier, is we set ourselves up as we want to help every student to achieve their absolute best and get them through higher education. But we have to be able to manage the expectations of what resources we have, what funding we have, and what exactly it is that we can support every student with. Funding. I think there isn't an access office in the country that doesn't go, if I just had some more funding, what I could do. I think we all understand the pressures the higher education sector is under at the moment, and we could do miracles with even a small more amount of funding. And that is a huge barrier. And time pressure. There's a lot of external pressures on our higher education institutions to meet these metrics that have been set out for them. We're under a time pressure. Students are only in really from September until March, and then they kind of focus on exams and disappear. There's a real tight time pressure that we're under in order to maybe find out that a student is struggling, that a student needs support, to reach out to that student, to be able to bring them in under the support systems that we have, and actually capture them and keep them within the system before they disappear out March, April, and then they're gone again. So we've a really tight period within which to talk and to support students. And also, the big one is decisions about higher education funding and policies are often made outside our institutions. And that is just a really annoying, irksome reality of today and how our higher education sector is funded, is that we can put down some of the most amazing ideas and all of these theories that we know will support students through their time in higher education, but we can't reach where the money is at or who it is that's going to make that decision. So these decisions are often made far, far away, just in an office somewhere else. So I suppose student success is, and how do we drive this change through? So these are kind of more less fun slides. There's like bullets on these ones about things that we can do in our higher education institutions. And the biggest one is that we need a whole institution approach. It cannot just be us in this room trying to push the idea of student success, push the idea of making our higher education institutions accessible to all students. We can't be the only ones who do that. We need a kind of whole institution approach. So I suppose, what are the key elements to do that? I kind of went a bit mad with the sliding things. We need leadership at all levels. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We need people from the very, very top all the way down through our different departments, faculties, administrations, all buying into the idea of student success. We need a culture on our campus that talks about this. We in USI very often talked about how we wanted to have a consent culture on campus, the idea that this was ingrained into everything that we did. And I think student success should be ingrained into everything that we do in higher education, because if we're not supporting student success, I'm not entirely sure what it is that we're doing. Throwing that out there. And we need that to be ingrained into our culture. Policies. We need to have policies that are not just written into our access departments. They need to be policies that are written into the academic departments. How do you deliver share your knowledge with your students? How is the best way to make that accessible? These need to be written into every part of our policy in our higher education institutions. Systems and processes, which are kind of the same thing as policies, but just actually making them happen. Student involvement. I think this is really incredibly important. That idea of student as partners in learning, listening to the student and the student experience and the student voice is so crucial when we're thinking about policies and how do we implement change and how do we support students. I think another reason it's so important is the student experience changes all the time. What I experienced in my first year of college, just before the crash, when they gave us loans on credit cards, compared to what a student experiences now, is very, very different. And it's really important that students are involved at every level on this. And I know there's student involvement and students as partners. All of these projects are happening at the moment in a lot of our institutions. Staff engagement. So again, it can't just be access staff talking about this. This is a whole institution-wide thing. And staff engagement from a number of different departments on how they see we can support student success. There are staff who are engaging with students on a daily basis that we don't know about. And they know what's working sometimes. They know what it is that's helping students succeed in their class, in their department. So it's important that when we're looking at this institutional-wide change, we're bringing in all of these key actors. Data. I suppose we are in an academic realm, so it's important that we are measuring and tracking what succeeds and how we can share that with other people. And evidence-based, which is the other side of data, is that it does this work, how does this work, and how can we get it through? So we need to design a process of change. So these involves your structures, your clear timeframes, a cross-institutional team. So again, it's not just falling on access staff to build this culture of student success. Student engagement, staff engagement, and your senior management support. We need to monitor and evaluate. So we need to monitor our students engaged in our higher education institutions. We need to evaluate it, and we need to examine impact on individuals and specific groups. So I mean, this kind of, I think, ties into our national access plan, and we all have key target groups that we're supposed to be reaching out to. So we need to be really looking seriously as whether or not this is working. This needs to be sustainable. They need to be embedded interventions. They need to be built into the systems that we have. We need to transfer learning. So there's loads of people in this room who are working on this, and I just think student success is something that's too important to not be sharing between our counterparts in different institutions. And we need to use this learning. So we're still in a process of this. Student success is only coming into the mind frame of a lot of our institutions about how do we inform institutional policies. But I suppose the two key areas on this is the staff capacity to implement change. And sometimes I talk to access officers and I'm like, and we need to do this and this and this and this. They're like, no, we've no room. You know, the staff capacity to be able to drive this change is really, really important. And the further research and funding that this is made a priority within your institution to explore this topic further and to drive this change on. So I'm going to whiz up here, I'm nearly at the end. So I suppose, how can our higher education institutions uphold this social contract? And I really like the concept of social contract. Maybe I'm a little socialist on the inside, but this idea that higher education institutions are providing a public good, there's a transfer of knowledge. We, I think, tentatively agree that higher education institutions will produce at least some workers at some point out of the system. And I think in order to be able to uphold that social contract, we need to embed student success right into the centre of that. I suppose some of the key conditions for this are well-funded student supports, something I'm sure is music to many people's ears here. Emphasis on early months and first year of study. And there's lots of evidence to show that early intervention, those first years of study, are absolutely and utterly crucial in order to be able to support student success and keep those students in the system. Integration of prior learning and experience is so important, and ongoing practice of learned skills. So that moving from the theory into actually practicing what you're learning. And there's lots of thoughts on that, about how that integrates and builds student engagement. Active learning, clear, focused institutional vision, which sometimes in the bureaucracy of higher education is a pipe dream, but that very clear vision of what we want to be able to do and achieve for our students. Collaboration among students, bringing students together so that they can participate in this. Adequate time on task, and I talked about this, giving the time that is needed, and out-of-class contact with faculty. And again, if there's any academics in the room who are just up to their necks with no time to spare, this maybe isn't what we want to hear, but we recognise that this is really important, that out-of-class contact with faculty. So what actions support student success? So pre-entry courses. which has been trialled for a couple of different target groups. I know when you see, for example, there's the pre-entry course for mature students, for students through the Access programme, and I think a lot of those of us who've worked on those recognise the value of those pre-entry courses in supporting those students. That tailored welcome, they're not just put through a conveyor belt and sent off into the system. The blended learning platform, student mentor scheme where students can learn from other students about student experience, accessible student support, so they're not hidden in the back of a website somewhere or they don't know where to go, and monitoring satisfaction. Are our students happy? Are they satisfied? Are we providing what they need? And what is it that we need to do on that? So I'm going to wrap up quickly on this, but I really think that student success and the concept of student success has to be the foundation of higher education. If we are not talking about supporting our students succeed and student success, I don't really know what our higher education institutions are doing. So student success, it has to be well resourced. It has to be institution-led. It has to be led across the institutions. It has to be led from upper management all the way down to every echelon of our institutions. And it really has to be student-focused. I know that's a bit of a no-brainer, but I thought I'd say it anyway. It has to be very, very student-focused. So I thought I'd keep with the theme. Student success is not just an individual's responsibility. As you can see, there's 3 elephants. There is someone who has to champion it on an institution. There are people who are going to be driving this forward. There's going to be the student in the middle of all this, hopefully wrapped up in our cushion of student success and student support. And there's going to be people who are making sure that this is measured, evaluated, successful. So this is a really a 3-pronged approach. It's not just one individual's responsibility, and it cannot be just left up to access officers, access departments, and the students themselves to try and drive this change forward. I think student success is what we've all been talking about for the last couple of days. It's the work that we do all the time. And I really hope that we can see it now integrate beyond our areas that we work in higher education institutions, and really becomes a cornerstone of what it means to be a higher education institution to support student success. So that's me.